Sorry, I tried to hit the end button just so I was hitting the start button. Hi, everybody. I'm Charles from GMAT Ninja, GMAT Club's resident verbal expert, guy with fat fingers, sometimes fumbles with the start button on the broadcast. Today, we're going to be talking about fill-in-the-blank questions on GMAT critical reasoning. And this is going to be a relatively stripped-down lesson. So they're not super, super complicated. I'm going to give you a little bit of theory on kind of how I want you to think about them in the beginning. Then we're going to go through, hopefully, 7 examples, time permitting. I chose them mostly on the basis of variety and difficulty. I'll say more about that in a moment. If this is your first time joining us, or even if it isn't, these are always live, so no second takes, no edits, no snack breaks, no beer, no nothing. So apologies for mistakes. I'm human. This gives you a sense of what it feels like to do tutoring with us. Love interaction from the group. So we've got a live crowd. Usually we get a few dozen people who actively participate. So if this is your first time in the live session, please, as we give you a question, give us your feedback, tell us what you think, tell us what you're struggling with, be honest about your answer. Love to see the struggles, helps make the lesson a little bit better. And this is video number, I think we're on number 7, series 3, video number 7, doing 9 in this series, 2 more next week, 1 at 8 a.m. Pacific Tuesday, our final in the installment of the Word Problem Bootcamp. And then next Friday, 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, 1 last sentence correction lesson. All right, a little bit of background on fill-in-the-blank critical reasoning questions. They're not that common on the GMAT. You're going to see maybe 10% of your questions will have a nice little blank and say something like, which of the following most logically completes the passage? Maybe 10% of your questions. But I see some bad habits on it with our students, with some of our friends on GMAT Club, where there's this instinct to just say, well, let me just jump right to the answer choices and start punching stuff in and see which one sounds best. Absolutely not what you want to do. So very, very simple approach here. Bad. Don't just start putting answer choices in. Doesn't help. Second thing I see quite a bit of, a little bit less, but I see sometimes, is people really, really overdo the categorization and say, oh, is this one a discrepancy? Is it weaken? Is it strengthen? Is it assumption? What is it? It's not necessarily a horrible instinct, but it also doesn't really do you as much good. One of the things about GMAT critical reasoning is, honestly, most of the mistakes we see aren't about the logic. It's about how you're thinking. It's about how you're reading. It's a misread, or there's some little tweak on the question that makes it sort of not fit as neatly into the categories as you would like. So don't shoehorn these into categories. That's not the habit you want to be in. Subtle distinction here. The only thing I really want you to do as a matter of fundamental technique on fill-in-the-blank questions that might be different from other ones, make sure you just take a moment, read through the passage, get your head around it first. Don't jump through that step. And then I just want you to think, all right, what's the blank doing? What's its purpose? Is it the conclusion of the passage? Is it something that's meant to support some other statement? Is it drawing an analogy? What is it doing? So that's it. Want a stripped down approach, intuitive, be careful with the language. If you've watched some of our other critical reasoning sessions, one of the things you'll hear me say over and over and over is keep asking yourself, their words or my words? Their words or my words? One of the most common mistakes is when people say, here's roughly what it says, and you paraphrase it into oblivion. So I'm going to keep an eye on that a little bit today with the live group. And again, the only real thing I want you to concentrate on in terms of your overarching technique on these specific kinds of questions, take a moment, invest smartly in saying, what is the purpose of this blank? So I've chosen 7 questions today. We might slice one off depending on how time goes. I try to keep these under an hour. So we're going to do 7 questions, hopefully. I've chosen them based on difficulty and variety. So I've got a mix of medium and hard questions. We'll see how the live group does with it. And then I've got a nice variety of sort of logical constructions with that blank. So there are a lot of questions out there. The easier ones just tend to be support kind of questions. Clearly, X is true because blank, and it's obviously just a strengthen. Trying to get you guys used to the variety where they can do absolutely anything there. One of them is an analogy question. It's kind of odd. So I want to get you used to just kind of taking what you're given in the blank and say, what does the blank demand of me? And then go out and find the answer choice that fits. That's it. All right, let's get rolling. All right, question number 1. That's not it. That's question number 1. There you go. I'll give you guys a couple minutes. And once again, anybody in the live group, as soon as you have an answer, please pop it up at us. Love to hear the feedback. If you go against the grain of the rest of the group, even better. All right, give you guys another 15 seconds or so. Seeing a nice mix of A, B, D, and E so far. So please don't be shy if you're stuck or if you've got something else. And if you're in the live group and you're stuck, let me know. Okay, got answers from about a quarter. I think you guys are either being shy or you're struggling, not quite sure which. But again, thank you again, everybody who's telling me what they've got. Got some disagreement. Fantastic. Again, fill in the blank questions. First thing you want to do is just say, hey, what's that blank doing? Doesn't have to be super technical. I'm getting questions from the live group. Are these always inference? No, they can be absolutely anything. And I'd even encourage you not to categorize too narrowly. There's kind of a school of thought out there that says, oh, every critical reasoning question fits into one of 7 categories. No, they can ask you anything, right? It's about how you think, how you read. They can give you something that doesn't fit neatly in any category. Fill in the blanks are a great example of that. They can give you anything, doesn't need to fit neatly into a category. Take what you're given, see what they're doing. In this case, it is a pretty straightforward one. This is just a kind of a strengthen or a support question. So what's that blank doing? It's trying to support this conclusion that the poll results contain an indication that expansion of the rail system, if successfully completed, might be unlikely, to achieve its stated goal of reducing congestion. Okay, well, why is that? And what are these poll results? What do we know by way of background here? Well, 80%, lots of people, saying they favor massive expansion of the rail system as a means of significantly reducing congestion on the highways. And they also say they're willing to help pay for it. So obviously they've removed funding as an issue. That's cool. All right. So let's see which one of these things is going to support this. Let's start with A. The proposed expansion to the commuter rail system will make it possible for some people who live and work in the suburbs to commute by rail. Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? It sounds like that's saying that more people in the suburbs will be able to commute. So that sounds like a positive. So how's that going to reduce congestion on the highways, which is what the passage is saying. So that has nothing to do with it. If anything, it strengthens the idea that people are going to start taking this train more. So fewer people on the road, less highway congestion. So not A. What about B? Most people in favor of expanding the rail system reported less congestion during their highway commute as the primary benefit they would experience. Let's think about that a little bit. Well, if most people who say they want to support the rail system are saying that they're doing it because they want less highway congestion, what does that suggest? It suggests that they're not going to take the train themselves. They're just saying, ooh, yeah, let's spend money on this rail system. That's going to be great because fewer people will be on the highway. Those people over there will take the train and my highway will be less congested. Well, if 80% of people are saying that, then maybe we have a problem. Maybe people won't actually take the train if everybody's funding the train so that they can have an easier commute when they drive. So I don't know. That sounds like something that's going to support this idea that the rail system won't achieve the goal of achieving congestion. So we can hang on to B. What about C? Of the less than 20% of residents not counted as favoring the expansion, about half claim to have no opinion. That has nothing to do with anything, right? Like we don't care about the 20% that say they don't support this. Really irrelevant. We still have 80% here that are favoring the expansion. So we can get rid of C. D. The twice daily periods of peak congestion caused by people commuting in cars have grown from about an hour each to about 2.5 hours each in the last 20 years. Okay, I saw a lot of people in the live group picking D, which is interesting. Because basically what we're saying in D is the rush hour traffic, those peak commute periods, have gotten a lot worse. They've gone from an hour each to 2.5 hours each. It's horrible. So you might pick D if you had misread that or misinterpreted that to say interpreted the conclusion to say that the rail system will eliminate congestion. So D's tempting if you're saying, well, look, D suggests that congestion on the highways is really, really, really severe. We're not going to fix the problem. Fair enough. But notice that's not what the conclusion's saying here. We're saying that the train would be unlikely to achieve the goal of reducing congestion, not eliminating, not making the highway commute wonderful, beautiful, smooth sailing, just reducing it. How severe the commute is now has nothing to do with whether the rail system will reduce the congestion. So for that reason, D is out. What about E? Expanding the commuter rail system will require the construction of dozens of miles of new rail bed. I've actually seen a lot of people pick this answer choice, which is interesting. I think certainly on the face of it, that's irrelevant, right? Like, who cares how it's going to be constructed, how that rail bed is going to be constructed? Has absolutely nothing to do with the long run of whether this rail system will reduce highway congestion if it's successfully completed. I sometimes see people make a bunch of leaps here and say, wow, the construction of new rail bed is going to cause congestion on the roads itself. But we don't know that. You don't want to make that assumption. All it's saying is we're going to construct new rail bed. Who cares? That might have absolutely no impact on congestion. Certainly would have no impact on it in the long run. For that reason, E is out. B is our winner. Okay. So that's again, the most common, if you really love the categorization, most common thing you see in fill in the blank, it's going to be some sort of support. It's going to end with since or because. Here's a blank. But again, there's wondrous variety here. Let's go on to the second one. It's going to be constructed a little bit differently. Give you guys some time, and as soon as you have an answer, go ahead and pop it in that chat screen. Awesome. Seeing lots of C's, lots of D's. So getting some disagreement. By the way, if you're watching this, I choose to kind of use the board and kind of write out notes because I think that's more authentic to the experience of what we actually do in the testing room on the GMAT. So if you're having a hard time following, you might want to take a screenshot of the question while I give you guys time to look at it. And that way you have it up in front of you as I talk through. So go ahead and do that quickly if you haven't already. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Getting mostly D's and a few C's. Cool. All right. So again, what's the purpose of the blank? That's where you always want to start on these. What are we looking for? Just an inference. That's it. Which of the following is true based on the passage? Cool. Not so bad. Well, what do we know? So we know that atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide are currently going up, are currently increasing, causing the climate to warm. So they already state that as a fact. Atmospheric levels are increasing. Those things cause the climate to warm. Fact. What else do we know? This effect, this greenhouse effect, is predicted by at least one computer model. Fine. And now here comes the fun part. The warming that has occurred so far is a great deal less than would be expected based on the model. One of the things you guys have heard me say, if you've watched any of my critical reasoning videos, and if you haven't, and if you're really struggling on critical reasoning, you might want to check out, we did a critical reasoning 101 and 102 a year or two back. You might find that helpful if you're totally new, getting obliterated by this level of question. Maybe take a look at that, come on back and watch this one later. Basic idea in there is that where do the mistakes come from? Often it's you misread a modifier or something like that. You drop some little piece of language that's going to radically change what's going on. It's a great deal less. I'm not saying that's where this particular question hinges. I'm just saying that those modifiers, those things that are going to tweak your scope, your strength, your magnitude, your number, just want to make sure those jump off the page at you. All right, so fine. A little bit of a discrepancy. Hey, the effect is predicted by at least one model. We know the climate's warming, but it seems like it's way less in this particular model. Why is that? Okay. So we're trying to figure out what can be concluded based on these three facts. A, the likely consequences of any warming of the climate are likely to be much less damaging than predicted. We don't know anything at all about the damage, right? This is just talking about the climate increasing, not increasing, and what the models say about it. Nothing at all about the consequences of that damage. For that reason, A is out. B, better measurements of atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide are needed. I don't think anybody's tempted by that. We can eliminate that pretty easily, because we're not saying it's a problem of measuring the carbon dioxide. There just seems to be a discrepancy between the measured levels of carbon dioxide and what's actually happening in the models, how much warming there is, what the model predicts versus what's happening in reality. C, there are factors besides the increase in greenhouse gas emissions contributing to the warming of the climate. I'm going to play with the live group a little bit. Got a lot of people picking C. I'm going to hang on to it. I'm also going to hang on to D for a moment, since those are the two that are wildly popular with the live group. And what about E? The definition of greenhouse gas should be considered. Really, really easy to get rid of that one. Nothing here about a problem of the definition of the gas. It talks about carbon dioxide levels going up. Warming is happening, just not as much as we expected. So it doesn't seem to be a definitional problem. All right, let's come back to C. There are factors besides the increase in greenhouse gas emissions contributing to the warming of the climate. Look at that phrasing really, really carefully. If there's factors other than the increase in greenhouse gas emissions contributing to the warming of the climate, suggesting that something else is causing the Earth to warm. Well, if that's the case that there's something that's not in the model, and by the way, we don't know what's in this model. All we know is that it's over predicting the amount of warming, right? So we don't know what's in there. We don't know if there's other greenhouse gas emissions in there or not. Fair enough. But let's set that aside for a second. There are factors besides the increase in the greenhouse gas emissions causing the warming. So that suggests that if anything, we're underestimating the warming. If that model doesn't include things that are actually warming the climate, then we would imagine the climate would be getting even warmer than the model predicts. That's backwards. Look at what's happening in the model. The model's predicting more warming than is actually happening. Reality is less warm than what the model says. If C is the answer, or if it's the case that there's other factors other than just greenhouse gas emissions, then we would actually expect the model to underpredict warming. And what it's doing right now is it's overpredicting it. For that reason, we can get rid of C. And what about D? D seems too lame to be the right answer, in my opinion. So first time I glanced at this question, my first thought was, well, that's too, the model's wrong. That's all we've got. Really, that's the right answer? Yeah, of course it's the right answer. Seems too obvious to be true. Often the case here. Don't overthink it. Sure, if the model is predicting something that's different from reality, sure, the model must be incorrect in some respect. Is it the way the model is constructed, or something about the data, or something else? Who knows? But totally reasonable to say the model must be incorrect in some respect. And if you're using cross-elimination really systematically, then it's pretty easy to land on D, and don't overthink it. All right, that was number 2. Here, have another one. Good. Give you guys about 20 more seconds. Looks like the live group's being a little shy. Feel free to go against the grain. Who knows? Maybe the speedy people are Googling the question and are cheating. So if you got something else, let us know. And yes, the GMAT loves insects for some reason. All right, now we're getting some disagreement. So somebody asked me, what does the idiom going against the grain mean? Good question. So when I say going against the grain, I mean, hey, everybody's going in one direction and saying the answer is B, for example. If you want to go against that and say that the answer is A, you're going against the grain of what everybody else is doing. You're kind of swimming against the tide, would be another idiom. You're not going to see either of those idioms on the GMAT, most likely. All right. What's going on here? So again, second one that's just a nice, clean inference kind of question. All we're doing is trying to find what's going to, so this is going to explain why something happens. Everything else in the passage is going to explain why something occurs. We're just looking for one thing that's true based on the passage. Find the four that are wrong. And somebody just made a comment. Manali, thank you. I think I know who you are. I'm going to play with that in a minute. So let's break down the passage a little bit, and then I'm going to make a comment about pre-thinking because I think that's getting some people into trouble, and that's interesting. Okay, so what do we know about these moths? We know that larger moths fly faster than smaller ones. Great. What else do we know about them? They have higher optimal body temperatures. And what's this business of higher optimal body temperatures? What's that all about? Well, when air temperatures fall below that optimal body temperature for a moth, the moth gets sluggish, sits on a piece of vegetation, becomes inactive, and becomes vulnerable to predators. That's it. So that's what we know. Great. So before I say anything else, there's a temptation, and I'm going to say this, I realize at some risk of offending GMAT Club partners who I think do wonderful, wonderful work and have a different philosophy on critical reasoning than I do. A lot of people go out and try to anticipate the right answer here. And I think that's dangerous. I actually see a lot of mistakes with that. So things might naturally be popping into your head here, and that's fine if it does. I'm not saying you should censor your brain. And as you're reading through this and saying, well, what do I understand based on the passage? You want to engage with it. That's great. But I don't want you to pre-think on purpose. I think that gets really dangerous because then you're opening yourself up to making either one or two things. One is making additional assumptions that aren't there, which is really, really dangerous, obviously. And even if you avoid that and just keep your logic really strict and really keep yourself strictly to what's here, I think the danger of pre-thinking is that you start anticipating something. And I think that can cause problems for you. And this is great. Out of the live group, I'm getting more and more feedback that that's something that causes trouble. When you pre-think, you start anticipating something. So somebody here said, well, yeah, I was anticipating the option, therefore large moths can easily be caught. Well, that's true. They can easily be caught if the weather, if the air temperature is lower, then they can easily be caught. Fair enough. But what does it do for you to anticipate that? Really very, very little, because what if that's not one of the answer choices? Then A, you run a risk of rejecting something just because it doesn't match what you were thinking. You might eliminate the right answer here just because it doesn't match. That's one risk. The other risk is, what if you fall in love with something that looks like it matches your thinking? That's the other risk. I see those two mistakes all the time. I was pre-thinking this. I was anticipating this thing. They didn't give it to me. I'm unhappy, now I'm making a mistake. So I would really caution against pre-thinking. If that's something that really makes you comfortable having good results with it, okay, cool, don't let me stop you. But I think for a lot of people, it's hard to execute on it well. Personally, for our students, we discourage it. Certainly, if we see problems with it, we discourage it, because pre-thinking can lead you down the road of making all kinds of assumptions. And I want you to react to these 5 answer choices. So your job here isn't to, this is going to sound warped, your job here isn't to find an inference that's logical exactly, because there might be tons of them. You might be able to infer tons of things based on this. Your job is to figure out which 4 of these things are wrong, and therefore, of this selection of 5, which one is right. That's all you're doing. The thing that's right might be something that's not totally intuitive, not obvious, might be too obvious, will almost never be the thing on a hard question that you anticipate it to be. Think of GMAT verbal as having 2 dimensions of difficulty. One is sometimes the language is hard and you struggle to understand what's happening. The second dimension of difficulty, right answers that look wrong and wrong answers that look right. My take on it is if you overdo the pre-thinking, you're much more likely to walk into a trap where you fall in love with something that's wrong, the wrong answer that looks right, or you might reject the right answer that looks wrong to you because you think what's happening here is, oh, those large moths are going to get eaten. Okay, enough of that. So let's go through these answer choices. Which of these things makes sense? A, do we know that large moths are generally able to maneuver better in flight than smaller moths? We don't necessarily know that they can maneuver better in flight. We just know that they're faster. Nothing about agility, maneuverability. No way we can infer A. What about B? Large moths are proportionally much more common in warm climates than in cool climates. Well, that would make sense. So kind of the point that Manali made, yeah, you know, these guys might get eaten. Well, under what circumstances? Air temperature goes down, they get eaten more easily, right? So there's some range of air temperatures where the big moths are lounging on the vegetation getting eaten by the predators. So what does that mean? Well, in a colder climate, those large moths are going to have problems, more likely to live in a warmer climate. Fair enough, we can keep B. C, large moths are more likely than large moths to be effectively camouflaged than on vegetation. We know nothing about camouflage, has nothing to do with it. C is out. D, large moths typically have wings that are larger in proportion to their body size. Nothing about that either, right? Nothing about the proportionality of wings to body size. D. E. Most predators and moths prey not only on several different species of moth, but also on various species of other insects. Again, who cares? This has absolutely no bearing on any of this. We don't know what these predators are eating, has nothing to do with anything we can draw from this. Can't make that inference on E. And by default, you're left with B, even if you didn't love it. Another awesome point made by my long lost brother in Michigan, Shovik. Yeah, thinking good, engaging in the passage good, pre-thinking, anticipating answers bad. And I want to draw that distinction really, really carefully, because what is this all about? Everything that, you know, all the good test prep people running around, we're basically constructing different ways to get you guys to think, engage, understand what's going on deeply in these passages, or deeply enough. Pre-thinking is one way to engage. My opinion, it risks getting you into a type of engagement that's flawed. But taking the time to digest, take a moment, see what you can understand from this, good. I'm just a little bit against forcing yourself to anticipate an answer, because then you get that confirmation bias that causes problems. All right, enough lecturing on that stuff. 4 more questions, less than half an hour. Here comes number 4. These are going to get a little weirder. Let's see if I can get this out of the way. Okay, should be better. Going to take a couple minutes. Again, don't be shy if you're stumped, guys. Okay, fantastic. Got some A's, got some B's, got some slowness, got some stumped, got some C's. Everything but D, I think, has popped up here. Will you be mad if I tell you D is the right answer? You should be, because it's not. All right. So part of the big reason I picked this question was I really, like is maybe the wrong word, but in terms of getting your mindset right to approach critical reasoning, fill in the blank in particular, you want to get your mindset right and not be too dismissive and kind of say, well, this is this kind of question. That over-categorization can get into trouble, just like pre-thinking gets you into trouble. If you get too narrow in what your possible answers are or what this passage is doing, that's where you get into trouble, right? So I would look at this superficially and I would say, okay, right before the blank, there's a therefore. So I'm looking for a conclusion. Makes sense, but that's actually not what's going on. What's the blank actually doing? Well, in a sense, if you like your jargon, you could say it's kind of an intermediate conclusion, I suppose. I'm not sure what good that does us either. But let's think kind of like normal humans. What is it doing? Well, that blank is going to be something that helps us find a basis for that requirement. Well, what's that requirement? So we're going to support this requirement or have a basis for that requirement. The requirement is based on two things. Before we get any further, what's the requirement? Requirement is that money be drawn from our treasury only when stipulated by laws passed by Parliament, the branch of government most directly representative of the citizens. Okay, so that's the requirement they're talking about in that final sentence. Great. And we're saying that this requirement is based on the belief that, first of all, exercising spending power involves the ultimate exercise of state authority. And therefore, here's the second thing. So basically, this is going to be something that provides support or a basis for this. So you're not just looking for a conclusion. So there's an easy mistake to make here. I was looking for a conclusion for the passage because of the word therefore. That's not it. We're looking for something that follows from this first thing. Exercising spending power involves the ultimate exercise of state authority. So it kind of follows from that. That's great. But ultimately, its role is providing a basis for that requirement. Very, very different thing. If you don't spend that time investing a little bit in the passage, you get yourself into trouble. All right. Let's talk about A. Reasonable to say that the right to exercise such a power should belong exclusively to the branch of government most directly represented the citizens. That supports this perfectly, right? Because we're saying that money should be drawn from the treasury only when it's passed by that branch of government that's directly represented the citizens. So in order to support that, well, yeah, we need to make that case that the power should belong exclusively to that branch of government. Fair enough. We can hang on to A. What about B? Exercising the power to spend public resources is in most cases, but not all, protected by the Constitution. I think that has absolutely nothing to do with it. Exercising the power to do this, whose power to do this, first of all? And second, if we say that it's not always protected by the Constitution, that obviously really does nothing to support this requirement. B's out. C. Modifications to any spending bill should be considered expenditures authorized by law. That one sounds a little bit tempting, but where are you seeing the modifications? I don't see any modifications at all here. C's out for that reason. We're talking about direct spending legislation. So it's talking about a provision that's in there, but we're not talking about modifying any existing laws or modifying any spending bills. D. Only officials who are motivated by concerns for re-election should retain that power. This is what we call the test writer has to make up some extra answer choices. Have no idea how that's relevant. People are motivated for re-election. Fine, absolutely nothing to do with supporting this requirement. E, designating funding specifically for the favorite projects of powerful politicians should be considered anti-democratic. That goes in the wrong direction. And this is a really easy thing to fall into here. That whole first sentence of the passage kind of gets this idea like, yeah, those dirty politicians, they're doing their favorite pet projects. And we're talking about democracy and it's anti-democratic to fund their pet projects. But look at what this whole passage is about. We're actually supporting their right to do that in the end, right? This requirement is that the parliament can still pass those laws. Hey, you think those guys are scumbags or not, doesn't matter. E's really tempting if you're kind of caught in that mindset of, oh, bad politicians, anti-democratic, favorite bills. But this does nothing to support the requirement that, that we pass these through Parliament. And E's out. Answer is A. Okay, this next one is, think of this a little bit of a break. I don't think it's so bad. It's a little bit of an odd construction too. And then the last couple are going to be pretty rough, I think. Maybe you guys will ace some. Sometimes you surprise me, and what I think is hard isn't what you guys think is hard. But 3 more. And this one's about food. That's why I picked it. Seeing lots of A's so far, but also seeing some slowness. So if anybody in the live group is getting something else, or if you're stuck, please let us know. Give you another 20 seconds or so. Okay, great. It looks like not a lot of trouble here, other than a couple people who I assume are somewhere in Asia saying it's nighttime, my brain's slowing down. I appreciate that. That's why I'm doing this in the morning here. All right. So the only reason I really picked this one, I mean, I'm joking that it's about food at high altitude. I live in Colorado, high altitude. Right now, I'm at the coast, though, eating some good low country boil. 10 points for anybody who can figure out where I am based on that. If so, chime in on the forums. 10 bonus points if you can figure out where I am right now. Low country boil. All right, and don't Google it. That's cheating. So all joking aside, again, there's this instinct to kind of say, oh, I'm looking for something that supports the conclusion. There's a since before the blank. I'm trying to support the conclusion. Not the case here. It's not what you're trying to support. You're trying to support a certain explanation. A little bit different. The mistake I've seen on this question before is just, well, yeah, one of these supports the conclusion, even though it doesn't necessarily support the reasoning. You're just trying to support the reasoning that it's the oxygen that caused the weight loss. That's it. Pretty straightforward. These guys had unrestricted access to food. Lucky guys. They were forbidden vigorous exercise. Lucky guys, I guess. I don't know. And they still lost weight pretty quickly. And they're middle-aged guys. Okay, fine. So which one of these supports the idea that it's the oxygen to blame for the weight loss? So A, decrease in oxygen intake has been shown to depress appetite. That looks too good to be true. Let's keep it. B, several weeks after returning home, the men still weighed less than they had before the study. Nothing here about the permanence of the weight loss. We don't care about that. We just care, why did the weight loss occur while they're at altitude? Was it the oxygen? Was it not the oxygen? Doesn't matter if they kept it off. C, the men all participated in the same kinds of exercise during their stay. Again, we're not interested in the variability among these men. And even if that's the case, has nothing to do with whether the oxygen caused it. C's out. D, The foods available to the men had fewer calories than the foods they usually ate. Well, if anything, that kind of weakens the idea that it was the oxygen causing it. Instead, the idea was that it was probably the food. So this actually makes this support less viable, this explanation less viable. So D would actually go in the wrong direction. He's the one I see people picking sometimes, and really nice job in the live crowd. Exercise at higher altitudes is more difficult than exercise at lower altitudes is. There's a temptation there to say, oh, well, you know, maybe that had something to do with the calorie burning and it really wasn't directly the oxygen. But notice here, they were forbidden vigorous exercise. So really has nothing to do with it, and certainly doesn't support the idea that the oxygen was to blame for the weight loss. So for those two reasons, E is out. You're left with A. Okay, I've got two more left, and I think we're going to end on time, which is awesome. So these last two, one I would say is a little bit strange, which is kind of the point. I'm trying to get you guys thinking a little bit more, not being too mechanical and sort of identifying question types out of these fill-in-the-blank questions. The other one I think is just vicious. I see tons and tons of mistakes on it. We'll give you the strange one first, and then we'll give you the super hard one to end. All right, mostly getting A's out of the live group, getting a couple B's sprinkled in there. And some people that I know are out there thinking that aren't responding. So that makes me wonder if there's a little bit of paralysis going on. Real quick, if you are a little bit stuck, let me know. Cool, starting to see some stuckness. That's great. Let us know if you're stumped. If nobody's stumped out there and you're just being quiet, then I'll race through this a little bit faster. Okay, so again, one of the things, if you've watched a lot of these little webinars, one of the things I say a lot is the title of the section isn't reading and grammar, it's verbal reasoning. You can say something similar about quant. It's not the math section. We say that casually all the time. I say it casually, but it's quantitative reasoning. What's the GMAT going after? It's not can you read this, it's can you reason in a certain way, in a broad way. They're trying to test you in a way that is going to punish you for really mechanistic thinking. And this is kind of a fun little thing they did here where they said, ha ha ha, let's come up with something that doesn't categorize neatly into any of the things we might see in a test prep book. Worked for a big test prep company about 20 years ago. I think we taught 6 different types of critical reasoning questions. And guess what? When you really look through the official guide, maybe 60% fit into those 6 categories. The rest are something else or subtly different. Really good case of that here. So what's the blank doing? We're trying to find an analogy, something analogous to this statement, defining what makes something a living thing merely by examining living things on Earth. We want something that is analogous to defining living things in general based on the subgroup of living things on Earth. Okay, so defining something based on a limited sample of them, trying to define the whole thing based on a limited sample. So notice their conjecture here a little bit. What's the rest of the support or rest of the background? Well, biologists have generally failed to define what makes something a living thing. Actually, some interesting comments there that I won't get into. Must be open to the possibility of life on other planets. So we're basically saying, the argument is basically saying, well, biologists have failed to define what makes a living thing a living thing. We must be open to the idea that there are living things elsewhere that we don't recognize. So we don't want to define living things based just on things on Earth. We don't want to define the entire population of living things based on a limited sample. What would be analogous to that? Well, take a look at A, what a mammal is by examining only a zebra. Yeah, fair enough. Zebra, small subset of the broader category of mammals. You don't want to define what a mammal is based on just that one animal. You will decide that all mammals are striped and make really strange sounds. You can Google that too. B, the laws of physics by using pure mathematics, nothing to do with what's going on here. So you could argue that mathematics and physics are related in some way, but you certainly wouldn't say that pure mathematics is a subset of physics. You're kind of defining one thing based on a different one. Doesn't make sense. C, what a fish is by listing its chemical components. Well, that's totally nonsensical. It's like, well, the chemical components of a fish, that's not a subgroup of a broader group. D, same problem. What an animal is by examining a plant. Those are 2 totally different things, presumably. So you're not going to find out about one based on the other. Fine. But the analogy we're trying to draw is subgroup versus the entire group. D's out. And E, what a machine is by examining a sketch of it. That's just I guess something that's a little bit different from the actual thing. It's a representation of the actual thing. Not what we're talking about. We're talking about some subgroup as part of a larger group. And you are left with A. Okay, we've got one more. We've got about 8 minutes. I'd love it if the live group surprises me here, but this is one of the questions this is my nominee, I think, for the question I've seen the most mistakes on over the years for the fill in the blank questions. And it's not that it's doing anything special or it's a different construction or anything like that. It's just hard. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes on this one and then we'll wrap it up. And really appreciate the honesty when some of the folks in the live group are telling me exactly why they missed it, and that's all. That's how you get better. So keep facing those sources of your errors in the face. It's great for you. Thank you so much for telling us about it, because I can guarantee you're not the only one making that same mistake. Getting great stuff here from the live group. Some A's, some B's, some D's, some admissions of stumpedness. So if you're doing this not in the live group and you're having a hard time here, you are not alone. Give you guys another 20 seconds or so. Sorry, I did that again. Thank you so much to the live group for telling me. This is what happens when I film live. Sometimes I make the mistake of failing to unmute myself. So I just gave you guys a very, very nice speech about what's going on here and failed to look at the chat screen. So apologies. This is what happens when we film live. No second takes, no edits. So what I was basically saying, the short version, y'all should have read my lips really, really well there, right? So what's happening here, the struggle in this question, nothing super special about it logically, but the thing that usually throws people off, the first thing that throws people off is, look, that last sentence is getting at two different things. It's not a simple find the inference. It's not a simple find the support. You've got two things going on. That fact, and I'll say more about what that fact is in a moment, that fact is either besides the point or it's misleading. So the temptation here is to find a reason why it's both beside the point and misleading, or why it might be one of those things. It feels like you're trying to support kind of both of these things at once in some way. Not the case. Read a little more carefully. It's either beside the point. Why is it beside the point? Because the food's often eaten raw. That's why it would be beside the point. What we're looking for is, why is it misleading? So our answer here is going to be a reason why that fact is misleading. And thank you to the live group for rubbing in the fact that I failed to unmute myself 2 videos in a row. That's true. I'll be better next week, maybe. All right. What's the fact that we're trying to figure out why it's misleading? This fact is that irradiation destroys significant amounts of vitamin B1 a food may contain. And the proponents point out that irradiation is no worse in this respect than cooking. So the fact is that irradiation destroys B1, but cooking is going to do that anyway, right? So how is that not beside the point? We already covered that in the final sentence. We want to know, why is that misleading in some way? And what does it mean to be misleading here? It means to suggest that irradiated food isn't so bad. So how is it that this claim that cooking destroys just as much B1 as cooking, how is that going to be misleading in some way? How is that going to mislead us to think irradiation is fine when really maybe it isn't? Okay, so with that in mind, let's go through these. And some of these answer choices are tough. A, it is clear that killing bacteria that may be present on food is not the only effect that irradiation has. Well, fair enough, but how is that? How does that mean that this thing is misleading? I really can't come up with a case that A somehow gives us a reason why this whole business of irradiation destroys B1 the same as cooking. I'm not sure how that really helps make that misleading, so we can get rid of A. What about B? I had a lot of takers for this one. Cooking is usually the final step in preparing food for consumption, whereas irradiation serves to ensure a longer shelf life for perishable foods. So again, whatever this answer is, and I'm going to hang on to B because we had so many takers for it in the live group. Remember, whatever this thing is, it's going to be something that misleads us if we take this fact into consideration. Misleads us into thinking that irradiation is better than it really is. misleads us into thinking that irradiation is okay based on the idea that it destroys no more than cooking. And I'm not sure that B does that, but I'm going to hang on to it out of respect for the live group that went about 60% for B. C, certain kinds of cooking are in fact even more destructive of B1 than carefully controlled irradiation is. Well, fair enough, but that's actually going to go the opposite direction. You want something that's misleading that makes irradiation sound better than it is. C certainly doesn't do that. First. Second, are we interested in certain kinds of cooking? Are we interested in that variety of cooking and how much B1 they destroy? Not at all. That spread of the damage done by cooking has nothing to do with any of this argument, so C is out. D, for food that is both irradiated and cooked, the reduction of vitamin B1 associated with either process individually is compounded. Let's think about that. So we want this fact to be misleading. Cooking destroys B1 also just as much as irradiation does. But think about this. So if this is misleading, it would suggest that so they're trying to make the case irradiation is fine, irradiation is fine, it's no worse than cooking. Yeah, but what if irradiation and cooking put together makes the food even worse? Now you've misled us, whoever wrote this argument, into thinking that irradiation is fine, when really if you're both cooking it and you're irradiating it, we have a problem. It makes it even less nutritious. So those things compound on each other. So whether you cook it or not, irradiation is going to damage the nutritional value of the food. Let's hang on to D. E, many of the proponents of radiation are food distributors who gain from foods having a longer shelf life. That has nothing to do with any of this reasoning. Who cares who's espousing this stuff? That doesn't matter. Okay, back to B. Cooking is usually the final step in preparing food for consumption, whereas irradiation serves to ensure a longer shelf life for perishable foods. All you're really doing there is saying, hey, here's a good reason why you're basically just supporting the idea that irradiation is fine. That really doesn't do anything to say this is misleading and really irradiation is a problem. B actually kind of takes you in the opposite direction. For that reason, you are left with D. And boy, that's a tough one to connect. And again, we got about a 10% hit rate out of the live group. So anybody who got it right, congratulations, very nice. You deserve a cookie. I will hand those out on the GMAT forum soon. Kudos. That's kind of like a cookie. And for everybody else, if you struggled on this one, you are not alone. This was the hardest one I could find in terms of what I've seen people struggle on. All right, that is it for today. I barely spilled over an hour. 2 more left in the series. Again, today was number 7. We have number 8, number 9. And next Tuesday, we're starting half an hour early. So for the live group, so this is Tuesday. I believe that date is the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken. We'll be starting at 8 a.m. Pacific. I believe that's 8:30 p.m. in India. And that's going to be episode number 4 in Word Problem Bootcamp. We're going to be talking about counting sets series, kind of this funky thing you see on your enhanced score report. Find a little category of questions. I'm going to be addressing the word problem versions of those. Not comprehensively, I only have about an hour, but we'll give you some insight to what to do if you see that as an issue on your ESR. And then Friday, so same time, same place, 8:30 a.m. Pacific. That's going to be, we're going to be talking about countable and non-countable modifiers on sentence correction. This is something I've been itchy to do for a really long time. I don't know why I put it at the end of the series, but that's a topic that I get a lot of questions about. There's a lot of funny things where you sort of start with this assumption of, oh, less always has to be something countable. And there's a bunch of GMAT questions out there where it's not that simple. So we're going to kind of get into that richness of both the basics of countable and non-countable modifiers and kind of the moments where you can look at a question and get a little bit tricked by it. And again, they're not meant to be tricky. There's actually a language thing underneath it. We'll go over those fundamentals, how they really work, how to think about them. So that's next Friday. 2 more left in this series. Come see us on the GMAT forums. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have fun studying.